மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. தேங்க்யூ.
As in the middle game, in the end game as well, it's common for a player to sacrifice material for some less tangible quality and position. And just as in the middle game, there are many, many ways this can happen and many forms of positional or strategic sacrifices. To begin this section, we'll see this game, Magnus Carlsen versus Hu Yifan, where the world champion Carlsen carried out a positional exchange sacrifice, putting almost unsolvable difficulties before his opponent. This was Carlsen Hu Yifan. Carlsen is the world champion. Hu Yifan, the top female player in the world. And this took place in the Tata Steel Tournament 2018. I believe it's in the Netherlands. So it's black's move. Carlsen was white. Yifan was black. And the queen trade is on offer, which has to more or less be accepted. So black took on g3. And Carlsen took back h takes g3, opening the h file, the best recapture. So the exchange sacrifice doesn't happen until quite a bit later in the game, but we're going to see the middle game leading up to it as well, because I think it's an important part of the whole example, and it's instructive as well. So here we can see kind of, it's, well, you might call it a queenless middle game here at this point, which tends toward an endgame naturally, but queen's traded in one pair of minor pieces. It's almost a middle game. And the next few moves were pretty natural. Black played bishop d6, developing the bishop. Knight f3, b6. Black prepares to develop the other bishop to the long diagonal. Looks very natural. This move does have the downside that it puts this pawn out on b6, where it can be attacked by a pawn break, which we'll be seeing, a4, a5. But it was going to be necessary, inevitably, because the pawn on b7 would be otherwise on the open file. Trying to develop with bishop d7 and put it on c6, in some cases, could be a nice arrangement, but the problem here is that the bishop is not very stable on c6, so it could be attacked by a knight, for instance, knight e5 at the right moment, or even c4, and at some point d5 then becomes more of a threat. So it's not so clear that that's anything Black should really consider. So b6 was played, and now a4. Typical method in this structure, very well-known structure, with the slight alteration of hg, which helps white a little bit. The open h file is a little bit useful for white, but other than that, the position is very normal, with hanging pawns. C and d pawns on open files, united, but at the same time they can both be pressured, and at the same time they can give white some space advantage, so it's a double-edged sword. This b6 is also typical, and the advance a4, a5 is a usual method for white in this structure. As we'll see, when the pawn reaches a5, it creates a good kind of tension for white that can only benefit white. The threat of constantly, at any moment, opening the a file, whereas black can't resolve the tension easily. So this is a very strong method, but also very well known. So bishop b7, black played, now a5. And we see that b takes a5, for instance. This is almost never going to be an exchange black wants to make, because in the resulting position now, the c-pawn is passed. It's not a form of hanging pawns as white had before, but actually a passed pawn, which can even be useful in the future. And also, and perhaps more importantly, the a-pawn, black's a-pawn, is weak. It's also a passed pawn, but it's not going anywhere, and it's isolated and can be easily attacked. Next would come king e2 and rook h to a1 perhaps, in different ways, but white has very strong pressure here. So generally speaking, black doesn't want to make this exchange b takes a5 under most circumstances, which means he cannot, or she cannot really release the tension on the queen side, and that's always hanging over her. A takes b6 at any moment can come, or even a6 in some cases. White can push forward with the pawn, but it's white who has the choice here. and black has to constantly adapt her play to being ready to meet this possibility. Okay, game continued with king e7, king e2. White connects the rooks. Both players connect the rooks. Neither king wants to castle. While it's still in some way a middle game, it's clear that soon will be some exchanges, and the king will be fairly safe in the center. Both on e2 and on e7, the kings are relatively safe. In black's case, her king actually came under some pressure later, but at this moment, it's best placed on e7, and castles would leave white as a clear initiative, because the king wouldn't be in position to help defend the queen side if necessary. King e7, king e2. Black played knight e4. It would be very nice if black could take white's bishop. The two bishops would be an excellent feature in black's position, and basically she would stand very well then. At a minimum, she could always give up the light squared bishop for white's knight, which would then generally lead to a draw with opposite colored bishops, but also basically the two bishops would be a great force here. Black would have excellent pressure. So white had to keep the bishop and played bishop e1. Also, of course, white wouldn't want to exchange the light squared bishop. So here now h6 black played, a move which will be necessary to release the rook from having to defend h7. And now c4. So this hanging pawn, one of white's hanging pawns, advances. Usually they're going to be best side by side like this. The downside is that they have to be protected by pieces when they're attacked frontally, but the upside is they control all of the squares in front of them. Oops. They control all of the squares in front of them, and they retain the possibility of either one of them advancing at the right moment. And it's hard here for black to put sufficient pressure on the pawns. Now came the first move, which maybe could be called into question a little bit, knight f6. I think this is a little bit timid, this retreat, voluntary retreat of the knight. There are a number of other moves possible. She wants to exchange the light squared bishops, but as we see, that's not really that great of a thing for black to do. I think it makes sense to play f5, which may not make black's pawn structure look so pretty. It leaves the e6 pawn backward, but that pawn's not really weak. It's hard to imagine white somehow rearranging his pieces to attack it, or to use the e5 square is also not so easy. Meanwhile, this would support the knight on e4 and keep some dynamic play in black's position. Even in the future, perhaps f4 could come as well, and somehow in some form. But basically, black keeps the knight on e4, and to get rid of that knight will take some effort by white, and then the weakening move f3 finally. But it's not going to be easy to do, because arranging f3 would require moving this knight away, and then protecting g3 sufficiently, and then so it's much better, I think, to leave the knight on e4 where it gets in white's way, and black is fine, I think, more or less. But she played knight f6, now bishop c3, so Carlsen used the opportunity to bring the bishop to a better square. On e1 it was encumbering his pieces a little bit. And now bishop e4, again, I think this is a little bit not best. Black plays a little bit passively, just wanting to exchange the light squared bishops and make a draw, perhaps keeping equality, something like that. But white gets a small advantage, and in fact the exchange of bishops here helps white to coordinate his position better. And the king comes to d3, it gains white some space, a little easier mobility, easier to maneuver for white. Also, the bishop on b7 is performing a good role, keeping the knight on f3 staying there, so it can't move because the g-pawn could hang. So the pressure on the long diagonal is actually means black's bishop is better than white's. And another thing is that here, when the a-file opens up, the bishop will help to guard a8, so black can challenge the a-file at any moment. So much better, again, I think, was just to go knight e4 and bring the knight back. Of course, here white can go bishop b2, so it's not as ideal as bad as before. White's bishop is better placed on b2 than it was on e1. But still, I think that was better than what black did. Other moves are also possible, bringing a rook into the center, for instance. Rook h to d8 or something, rook h to c8, something like that was also possible. But bishop e4 was played, and now rook h to b1. White put the pressure on the queenside h file. Is no longer very useful, but white has some frontal pressure on the queenside, and now the b6 pawn is under attack. So black had to deal with that. So she took on d3, trading the bishops, and then guarded with knight to d7. But we'll see that slowly black's being pushed back into passivity. So the knight guards. On the other hand, if bishop c7, then it's possible to play bishop b4, and this is similar to the game black's king is pushed back. Also, again, b takes a5, while this easily defends the b6 pawn by trading it off. This is not what black wants. Actually, first white would check probably on b7. It's better to throw in this check. But in any case, then rook takes a5, and now there's great pressure on black's a pawn, and white has a passed c pawn as well. Sorry, once again, there's even stronger here. There's also just to be the positional factors, of course, are important to point out, but in this position, white can just win a piece by playing c5, attacking the bishop, and then c6 on the next move. But regardless, black never wants to make this exchange b takes a5. It's not really a solution. So knight to d7 was played. And now Carlsen made a nice maneuver. The knight looks good on f3, but it's not being utilized as effectively as it could be. And in order to increase the pressure here, white needs to change the position of this knight. It has no real prospects on f3, but on e4, it will cause black big problems. So Carlsen played knight to d2, maneuvering the knight to e4, an excellent way to increase the pressure. Here black played rook h to d8. She adopts a very passive way of playing, just retreats her pieces and hopes to hold the position. And there's reasonable chances to do it, but black's position is really strained to the breaking point this way. I think maybe again it's worth considering f5, stopping the knight from coming in. Of course, this weakens black's position on the e file, and here it could actually be somewhat relevant. There is an additional weakness on e6, but by playing king f7, rook h to e8, black can always guard that square. There's even a kind of a sneaky counterplay with h5, h4 possible here, trying to get some play on the king side. So, again, black basically refused to make concessions and slowly got pushed back. Rook h to d8 is a normal looking move though. Now knight e4, and white would like to capture the bishop, followed by bishop b4, for instance. But it's not so much that, that white's necessarily going to capture the bishop, but just that he's going to continue building up the pressure. And it's hard to find a move for black. So of course after f5, white will take the bishop. It was worth considering this anyway, but this position looks kind of unpleasant for black, and now it can force the king here, and eventually white tries to prepare d5. It's quite a difficult position for black, but so instead Hu Yifan played bishop c7, keeping this bishop and refusing to give it up again. Now came bishop b4 check, and so white continues to gain room. The king has to retreat. So clearly white's made some progress, and now in order to restrain the e5 possibility and just to gain space in general, Carlsen played f4. And there's no doubt black's position is passive, but she's trying to hold this position and has some chances to do it. Now, but it's hard to find moves for black a little bit here, because it seems like almost all of black's moves have some downsides. Moving the rook away from the a-file, as happened, allows white to open the a-file and invade with the rook. But otherwise, the bishop can't really move away because white will have some some invasions on d6. Always there's also this bishop's d6 move is possible here coming up. So eventually, black played rook a to c8. If instead trying to break out with e5, to use the fact that the rook is on the same file as the white king, it's of course d5 is good for white here, but even stronger after e5 is bishop d6, which is one of white's ideas in this position. And this just blocks the d file, so white will win a pawn. So for instance, bishop d6, knight d6, king e7, f takes e5, and the knight is protected and white wins the pawn. Black played rook a to c8, a takes b6, and now black had to take back with a pawn. Of course, bishop takes would allow knight to d6 check, winning a rook. And if knight takes b6, then one way of playing is bishop c5. And once again, black doesn't really want this pawn structure. The a pawn is very weak. It's attacked and can be further attacked by rook a6 and rook b to a1. Also, white has again passed c pawn now, so the pawn structure is stronger. Very difficult position for black. A takes b6 she played, and now rook a7 came. So the rook invades. So one by one, white increases the strength of his pieces. But Hu Yifan is still holding. The passive position that black has is unpleasant, but its game is not decided yet. And now she played knight to b8, which was a very tricky move. This was a very clever way of arranging black's defense. So this little backward move, however, threatens knight to c6, which attacks the rook, and the pawn on d4. So a very poisonous move. And furthermore, there's even a threat of rook takes d4, king takes d4, knight c6 check, winning a pawn. So it's not easy for whites because knight c6 will also attack white's bishop on b4. So it's not easy for whites to just play a normal move and keep up the pressure. So for this reason, Carlsen now sacrificed the exchange, which no doubt he prepared in advance. Rook takes c7 before black's move. I'm sure he was intending this. Removing this important bishop and allowing white to further increase the powers of his pieces at the cost of the exchange. So black had to take, and now knight to d6 check. And the knight comes in. One of the main points is to improve the position of the knight and gain an eternal outpost for this knight. So here black played king to d7. So giving back the exchange, white has no pawn for the exchange yet, but giving back the exchange is not going to really be sufficient. King d7 is the only way to keep the material for now. If, for instance, king e7, then white can play knight to b7 check and win back the exchange, and then this kind of position, still equal material, but white has finally overstretched black's position. There's a number of good moves for white. Probably the clearest is c5, after which black loses a pawn. He can't take or otherwise move his b-pawn because bishop a5 wins the exchange. So he would have to play something like king to d7 to get off that diagonal. Also, if knight to d7, it doesn't help because white would take, and if the knight takes, then bishop a5 pins the knight. So, for instance, if king to d7, c takes b6, rook to b7, and here, while black might be able to play king c6, and knight d7, trying to regain the pawn, white also has bishop f8, targeting black's pawns on the king side. This move has kind of been in the air for a while. In this position, these pawns are vulnerable, so white should win this. He'll have an extra pawn, and black will have to go to contortions just to gain back one of the pawns. So, after knight to d6 check, black played king to d7. Now knight takes f7, attacking the rook, rook d to c8, knight e5 check, king e8. And now bishop d6 came, attacking black's rook, rook b7, the only way to save the rook and protect the b pawn. Had this pawn fallen, so let's say rook a7, rook takes b6, white would have a decisive advantage here with the extra pawn, with the pawn, 2 pawns for the exchange and a dominating position. So instead, black, of course, kept the pawn. So here, kind of we'll sum up the outcome of white's exchange sacrifice. He has 1 pawn for the exchange. Technically not enough material. But if we look at this knight on e5, what a strong piece is and how strong the bishop is as well, working together with it. In fact, these 2 pieces control many squares in black's half of the board, basically providing a barrier against the black king advancing. Black's rooks are very passive, so at this moment you don't feel the superior strength of a rook compared to a minor piece. Nevertheless, the exchange sacrifice is not so clear. While white's running no risk, black has defensive chances, and one of the points is that black can offer to exchange this knight. And then the A file is accessible for the black rooks, potentially to gain counterplay, which is what happened. So it's not so clear. If we imagine both sides having an A pawn, perhaps a black A, let's say black A pawn on A6, so that this B6 pawn is still weak, or A5 maybe, and pawn on A4 for white, then it's much better than version, because there's no A file for black to use. But here black has some play. So Carlsen played C5. He needs to get on with things, because otherwise knight C6 is coming, challenging the white knight, and it won't be very, very easy for white to do anything without that knight on e5. So c5, attacking the pin pawn on b6. Now black played knight c6. So she continues to challenge white's knight. If knight to d7, this would do the same thing while protecting the b pawn. But the problem is then here white has the option of knight c4, and the black knight is badly placed on d7. The b pawn is still lost, so white will take anyway, because the knight is added as an attack, and if b5, knight a5, and again the knight on d7 doesn't help black to defend. It allows that white knight into a5, and after rook a7, the only way to save the rook, then rook takes b5, and here white's again won a pawn, but in this case black is unable to get any effective activity, and the knight is badly placed on d7. So instead knight c6 black played. So now came rook takes b6, rook takes b6, c takes b6, and she had to back away from the exchange of the knight, which was the plan, and play knight to d8 in order to stop the b pawn. But this is a good plan of counterplay. Black stops b7. The knights can in fact blockade the pawn, and will do it with tempo, while the black rook can invade by the a file, or perhaps the c file. So on one hand, white's pieces, the bishop and knight, are very well placed. White has excellent centralization, but it's not so easy to get through, and then black will have these kind of counterplay with the rook, and it turns out that the position is only a little bit better for white, but practically speaking it's extraordinarily difficult for black to defend, and it's not surprising that she wasn't able to. So knight to d8 though, not knight takes e5 according to the plan, because after white recaptures there's no stopping the b pawn. Next comes b7 and then b8. Knight to d8, black played, and now bishop c7. So white anticipated knight to b7. And here, rook a8. I think this was also the best move. The threat is to take the black knight, because in this position, the b pawn will then be unstoppable. So just to illustrate, in case black makes some random move, like h5, let's say, the threat is bishop takes d8. And now if king takes d8, then b7, followed by knight to c6, or just queening the pawn. And white wins. While if rook takes d8, then knight to c6, and now black has a way to stop the pawn, for now with rook to d7, but the rook is too passive. And after king c4, and after king c4, white simply plans to play king to b5 and king to a6 and then b7, and there's no stopping white's plan. So in many cases we find that the rook is unable to fight against the passed pawn working together with white's knight and king. After bishop c7, also it's interesting if black would continue with the play knight b7 with the intention to block the pawn as was intended, then would come knight to c6, and after rook a8, knight a7 would prevent black's counterplay. I think this is why she avoided this possibility. And here, king c4, king b5, white increases the pressure. And so it's very difficult for black. Her pieces are totally passive. So it was extremely important right away to get the rook in with rook a8. Now king c4, white played, bringing the king up. Knight to b7. Black, again, should be careful that white doesn't get a chance to exchange on d8 at the right moment, and instead blocks the pawn. King b5, rook a2. So counterplay a little bit for black. Hu Yifan has defended very well since the exchange sacrifice, but the position is extraordinarily difficult. Now Carlsen played g4. This is a clever move. He had no immediate way through and instead asks black to take pawn on g2. And here she played king e7, which, well, black waits for white essentially to commit and also prepares knight to d6 to bother the white king. So she's hoping to play knight to d6, in which case white would then, if white takes it, the king takes and black is ready then to meet b7 with king c7, and otherwise the rook will come behind rook b2 and everything is fine for black. But it turns out not to be so simple. The immediate capture on g2 was possible, but after king a6, white attacks the knight, knight to d8, its only move, and then king a7, and black is black's in a lot of trouble here, a lot of difficulty. Still, maybe she's holding, but white's planning b7, white's planning bishop takes d8 followed by b7 at the right moment, and it's not so easy for black to defend against this. Black put king e7, now g3. So it turns out that black doesn't get the g-pawn now. If rook a3, then f5 is the answer. And the bishop is in touch with the pawn. Black can't take it because knight g6 check. So black checked on d6, and now white has to capture the knight. So this is helping black in a certain way. This bishop on c7 was very annoying, and it helped to guard b8, so it made white's pawn more dangerous. So white had to take, of course, king c6 would be a terrible mistake after rook to c2, when black checkmates, and king b4 just wouldn't really be any very effective. Black would check again with the rook, for instance, rook b2. So bishop takes d6, king takes d6, and now not b7 because king c7. And black stops the pawn. So instead knight to c4, and it turns out white's able to still put a lot of pressure on black, and it's still an incredibly difficult position. Knight c4 check. So black had to be ready to stop the pawn with his king, with her king to d7, and now king to c5. So b7 again is met by king c7, but white plays king e5, king c5 with the covering d6 with the threat of knight e5 check, followed by king c6 when white's winning. So again, it's real difficult to fight against this strong knight and supported with a king and a passed pawn, but it's possible. So rook c2. Now black's just pinning the knight, so stopping white's otherwise deadly threat of knight e5 and king c6. How to make progress now? White's needed to clear some more squares for king and create a second passed pawn, the d pawn. So he played f5, threatening to take on e6 and divert the black king. So black had to take, g takes f5, and now rook f2. Black played threatening the pawn. And white played knight to d6, protecting the pawn, and preparing to basically to also to go king d4, king d5, and eventually b7, king e6, these various different plans. So the knight jumps into this square. Rook g2, black played, now knight e4, so white's ready to guard this pawn as well. The other point is if g4, g4 was also possible, but I think that h5 now is the problem mainly. So white had to avoid that because of course, if g takes h5, rook takes f5, check, knight e5, then black plays king c8, and white's not winning here. So knight to d6, white played, rook to g2, and knight e4. White's able to defend the g-pawn and continues with this constant standing threat. Black has to be very careful how she prevents the pawns from advancing. Rook b2, g4, rook b1, and black has, again, if rook to g2, king to d5. This is an example of how difficult it is. All kinds of little tricks in this position. So now white's ready with knight c5 and king c6 again, and if rook takes g4, then there's f6. Black's losing the king and pawn ending after rook takes e4, and also white's creating another passed pawn at the same time. Even stronger though is knight c5. Actually, this is more decisive, and simply bringing the king c6, and next comes b7, and the pawn's unstoppable. So black has to be very careful, and she played rook to b1, staying behind the b pawn. Now knight to d2, another tricky try for white. It's hard to make progress, but this creates problems for black. Rook to h1, black played. Now d5. And here, Hu Yifan, under pressure for the whole game, finally made a decisive mistake, h5. Trying to make this exchange, which would get black closer to the draw, just to exchange the pawns on the king side, and instead she had to, turns out that loses, but instead she had to play rook to c1 check. And now, after knight c4, just to illustrate how careful black has to be, she has to continue this holding pattern with rook to b1, as the position was earlier. Not rook to c2 in this position because it's a completely normal move, obviously keeping the knight pinned. But here white wins because after d6, the rook doesn't have access to b2 or d2. So b7 is the threat, and this is winning for white. King c8, the only way to stop it, and then king d5 with the plan of knight e5 and then d7. And now if black plays rook to c1 to try to stop pawns from d1 and b1, then comes knight e5. And after rook b1, d7 check, king d8, king d6, and white wins. There's threat of knight c6, checkmate, knight f7. Also after rook b6, knight c6 would force black to give up the rook for the knight, and the check on d1 does nothing because after king e6, again white threatens the same things. So just normal looking move, rook c2 would lose. So absolute accuracy is required. Black can play rook b1. Now after d6, again she has to be extremely accurate and keep the rook on the b file. Rook to b3 is the only move. And the problem white has to make progress is that in order to chase the black king away from d7, the knight has to move, but then the knight is no longer providing a shelter for the white king. So knight e6, black can play king d8. And now, if king c6, black can check, and king b7, and from here, after rook c1, it's not apparently possible to make any further progress. It's kind of surprising, but the black's actually able to hold this position according to very intricate analysis. There's also, of course, it's possible to make some ideas that king d5, rook b6, and king e6, and try to attack the kingside pawns, which is also dangerous for black, but it's also not conclusive. There doesn't appear to be any win. at least for what I've seen. But it's an amazingly difficult defense, and wouldn't be surprised if there actually is some sort of win for white. Black played h5 though, losing patience finally after a long defense, and now came d6, and it turns out that white is winning now. b7 is the threat, and the knight covers the b1 square. So there's no rook b1. Black played king to c8, so is the only defense. And now g takes h5. And this diverts the black rook. Black can't stand to have another pawn, and for the exchange, another pawn that's potentially passed. So she took on h5, king c6. And now the threat is just to play, for instance, b7 and d7, in which case the pawns won't be stoppable, or to bring up the knight. So here, if black took on f5, for instance, then d7, king d8, b7, and if rook f6, king c5, and the king just retreats along the c-file, not allowing the black rook to stop the b-pawn, and white queens the pawn inevitably. So black played here king to b8, stopping the b-pawn with a king and hoping to stop the d-pawn with a rook from h8, but this is not going to work out. After knight e4, rook takes f5, knight c5, black resigned. There's no defense to the coming knight a6 followed by b7, or knight e7 followed by b7. So essentially the b-pawn is queening. In other words, rook to f7. If black tried to defend in such a way, then white can play knight to d7. If the king moves, then b7. And if rook takes, king takes, and this pawn queens far before black's g-pawn. So after knight c5, black resigned. So I think, well, here we've seen a strategic sacrifice, the goal being to obtain centralization, pass pawns, superior pieces that proved, despite the rook eventually becoming active and showed its full power, still, in the meantime, white was able to attain other advantages that eventually overcame black's advantage of the exchange.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.